Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for RSA 2018 Recap with the Experts, Think Beyond. We're going to be getting started in just a couple moments as we wait for other attendees to join in. Again, we'll just be getting started in just a few moments. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and begin. I'd like to start off by introducing our two speakers and our key experts for today's webinar. First, we have Malcolm Harkins, Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cylance. We also have Ira Winkler, President at Secure Momentum. And just before we begin, I'm going to be going through a couple housekeeping slides just so you understand the Zoom platform and a couple of the widgets that we have. So you will see a few widgets at the bottom of your screen. During the presentation, you're able to submit any questions via the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We will be having some time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar, so be sure to ask all of your questions at any time using the Q&A button. Your feedback is essential to us, so we will be having a poll at the very end of the webinar, so please be sure to fill that out so we understand how we can better assist in future webinars. Also, for those of your colleagues that were not able to join, we will be recording today's webinar, and this will be shared out. It will be emailed to everyone who registered, and we will also be putting it online. If at any point during the webinar you have any technical questions or concerns or content questions that can't be answered during the Q&A session, feel free to contact us using webinars@cylance.com. Once again, that's webinars@cylance.com, and we're going to go ahead and get started with that. So I'll pass this over to Malcolm.
Hey, thanks. And Ira, thanks for joining me today. I tend to be a person that always try to reflect back on things. You know, where have I been? Where am I at? Where am I going? Because I tend to get a lot of learnings on that and different insights and perspectives. And I'm excited to do this recap and, in essence, reflections back on RSA 2018 with you. You know, one of the things that had started the week on the Monday before the main conference kicked off was a joint U.S. and UK announcement of a Russian hacking campaign. And in my memory, this seemed to be the first time that I saw two nation states jointly announcing something like this, and also providing specific attribution to the threat actor and threat agent, in this case, a nation state actor, Russia. You know, I'd love your perspective on it. You know, what did you think of the announcement? And from your perspective, was this an unusual event for having this type of announcement done, and particularly straight, you know, heading into RSA?
This was really unusual from several fronts. I mean, people couldn't agree, for example, on the poisoning of the Russian defector in the UK previous to this. And it was a big announcement to see whether or not the US was going to confirm and support the decision or whatever else there was. When people start to go ahead and just say, because I think this is actually really important, when you take a step back and let's go for example, the Sony hack. When the Sony hack happened, everybody was talking, who is it? Who, you know, what type of attack it was? Was it this person or that person? Then it came out that it was it was attributed to North Korea. And people were saying, no, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. And the reason this is important was it was slow in coming out, but then once it came out, there wasn't a unilateral support for it. And that led to a whole complete discussion as far as who was to blame. Was it really to blame? Was there hype with it or so on? And the reason I say all this is when you have the two major players on the world stage who have the most capability with cyber, let's just say short of, for example, Russia and China, coming together and saying we attribute it to this one organization, it's hard for people to start to question it. Because when somebody comes out, they say, oh, it's a political issue. But when you can get two countries to agree that frankly have not previously agreed, it makes things appear that much more important. It makes it appear that much more notable and that much harder to contradict, especially when you have two people with different assets all over the place. You know, I mean, we work together with the UK, but they clearly have their own assets, their own goals, their own drivers, and coming together to say this is Russia performing these attacks was really notable, even though a lot of people just probably said, oh, Russia's attacking us. Okay, yeah, I thought they'd do that anyway. But in this case, the fact it was, I mean, in all honesty, the attribution itself was less notable than the US and the UK coming together at the same time to do this jointly, because maybe besides of just doing this jointly, you know, making an announcement, maybe we could also start to respond together as well.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and I totally agree. And I also thought the timing of it, again, heading into a big, what I'll call PR week with RSA, was also, you know, consciously and thoughtfully done to maximize the awareness to this announcement. Now, the other thing that I'd love your perspective on, I've certainly got some strong opinions of my own that I'll share, and it'd be interesting to get your view. Attribution is an interesting topic. And, you know, when I think of the risk equation that we're all familiar with, of risk as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence and impact, and I think of my role as a chief security officer, chief information security officer, I look at it and I go, the attribution to the threat actor and threat agent is interesting, but other than perhaps understanding the motivations and things that I need to do from that angle, I can't control, as a chief security officer, chief information security officer, the threat actor and threat agent. And so I think sometimes the over focus on the threat actor and threat agent is a misdirection and causes us to be able to give ourselves an excuse to not focus on what we actually can control, how vulnerable we are. And the one thing that I know over decades of doing this, that I can with certainty do attribution to the control that failed and the owner of that control that failed that allowed a bad thing to occur. I'd be interested in your perspective on the attribution and where we should be focusing attribution focus on the threat actor and threat agent, or the controls that failed that allowed the breach to occur.
Well, we didn't talk about this, but you actually set up a perfect pitch for my book, Advanced Persistent Security, because honestly, in that book, I make a very big pitch because too many people use attribution, as you're saying, to deflect blame that their security sucks. It's like, oh, you know, instead of saying, well, could I have stopped this attack? It's like, oh, it was North Korea. Oh, North Korea, you couldn't have stopped the attack. It's like, yeah, you could have. Russia did this. Oh, you could have. Yes, you could have. If you had better protection and stuff in place, you could have stopped this. But the point is, though, that there is something to be said for attribution, because depending, so I do incident investigations periodically. And when I do these things, there's a question of what is the purpose of the attack and who's doing it. And we need to consider it. So one time, for example, I was investigating a bank robbery, you know, computer-based bank robbery. And when you see one bank robbery, as you start looking around, you find a dozen other things usually. And so we came across this one thing where we came on a system that does electronic funds transfers, and somebody owned the system, and it was not the bank. And we went on and we started looking at it. It's like all this person did was set up a where site. Now, the reason, then we had to figure out, was that a false flag, or was that really the only thing they did? Because the issue was, if that was the only thing they did, and it looked like we just found some immature person who just randomly stumbled upon a system he didn't have a clue about, and just took it over to exchange software with his buddies. And so when we looked at that, we were able to go ahead and say, okay, I only need to clean up this system, probably look around for others that might have been compromised, but I really only need to clean up this system because it doesn't look at all like he intended to steal money. And if he did, that would have launched a whole different set of attacks. Now, coming back to Russia, when we're talking about something more advanced, when we're dealing with Russia, you can start getting their methodologies if you deal with them frequently enough. Again, you have all the naming of them fancy bear because it's different whether you're looking at APT 28 versus APT 29, whether one's the GRU, the other's the SBR, and other people. So you need to know that because they use different sets of software. So you have to know what to look for. You have to know, well, if they did this, what else are they possibly targeting? What other systems are in place? So, for example, one time I was responding to a company that was essentially owned by the Chinese at one point, and we had to look at this because we found indication that there was a problem, but then we had to go back knowing it was the Chinese. We then had to go ahead and look at we said, we need to look at your BlackBerry Enterprise server. We need to look at your file servers and so on, because we know that once China goes in, they look at taking over an organization's command and control structure. So now in the grand scheme of things, them coming out with an attribution for this set of attacks is interesting. However, if you are an organization that's dealing with this set of attacks and now know that it's potentially Russia, you now know, okay, I know this might be Russia, therefore I know there are other TTPs, so I forgot what that stands for, but I know what else to look for, and that's more important.
Yeah, that makes sense, Ira. And again, I think as we've both discussed here and with your examples, attribution is useful, but don't over focus on the attribution to a threat actor and threat agent, because it can be distracting. It can be deflecting accountability. It can distort sometimes where you can actually make a difference. And again, getting back to what you said in your book, and like you said, we haven't talked about this, is we've got to focus on what control failed, why did it fail, and how do we make improvements going forward, and use the threat actor and threat agent attribution to refine our investigations, evaluate motives, and gain some perhaps different perspectives on things.
Right, and don't get me wrong. 99% of all the hype as to who did it is completely useless unless you are a highly skilled investigator that can make use of it. You're only making use of it in the response to the incident and knowing where else to look. The rest of it, though, is a bunch of hype because, honestly, at some point, they probably got in because of a lot of security vulnerabilities, which, honestly, again, that's all 99% of most organizations can address.
Yeah, and this brings us to the next slide. Again, everything old is new again, or is it? The conference theme for this year was Now Matters. My view is now has always mattered, because the choices we make now, the decisions we make now with regard to the risks that we think are acceptable, the controls that we're deploying or operating our environment affect future risk. Because what I do today affects the risk dynamic a minute from now, a week from now, or a year from now, or in the case of things like Meltdown Inspector, 20 years from now, as we've seen with those things. Again, the RSA conference had countless speakers, 50,000 attendees, 17 keynotes, hundreds of other discussions and dialogue. Again, I'd be interested in your view of how much innovation really is truly seen when you walk the floor with the hundreds, if not thousands, of vendors, and what is honestly in some cases just putting lipstick on a pig and putting a new veneer on a control that basically has not been sufficiently operating for a while. What did you see as you walked around and as you ran into people and looked at things on the floor?
To be perfectly upfront, I really saw a lot of the new veneer, for lack of a better term. You know, you see a lot of people trying to say my product does GDPR. It's like, well, you did the same thing. It's like, yeah, but it also helps with GDPR. There's a lot of Me Too's going on with a bunch of different things. I see things like inventory security orchestration. I see a lot of tools which went out of favor, which came, you know, which somebody else is thinking is now new. And it's like, okay, great. I see a little bit of additive types of functionality among it. So a lot of vendors are just there saying, we're doing a little bit more in this realm. It's like, well, we were doing this, but now we have this cool new feature which totally revolutionizes everything we do. It's like, well, no, it just is a different display for the same data. And that kind of worked. I see some companies, like mostly the larger companies, they started out with a niche, and now the larger companies are adding new features to try to be more like vulnerability management turning into governance. You know, you have some network detection tools that are now turning into SIM products and stuff like that. But
so a lot of potential confusion and certainly a lot of volume of vendors and marketing messages and people adding this feature, that feature, twisting it this way or that way. You know, one of the dialogues that you and I had ahead of this was how do people find, you know, value in the volume of the messages that are out there? And again, I'd love your perspective on it, because it's a challenge when a security officer or a member of their team shows up to these type of conferences to really walk away with something that provides them insight and innovation to allow them to transform what they're doing. Yeah, how do you think about that here on this next slide?
Well, I kind of think you really have to go, as the slide pretty much says, you have to go with a plan. There's no way around it. If you don't go in with a plan, you're wandering around just looking for who has the best giveaways, where can I find chocolate?
Don't forget the beer crawl. That's always who's got the best beer on tap.
Well, that's true. That's later in the day, and I might have to forgive myself because there's no way around this one. But I'm near Annapolis, and the Blue Angels are practicing for the Naval Academy graduation, so there's no way to shut down F-18s going over my head. So what's happening is, if you do not plan ahead, you're going there. You really have to look at the vendors, because the floors are so massive. I mean, maybe sometimes you could go say, okay, I'm going to walk the floors generally in a pattern, see what I like, and then go back later during RSA. But if you don't go in with a plan ahead of time, knowing specifically the type of tools and technologies that you're looking for, if you don't have concerns so you know which questions to ask to filter vendors out, you're just going to sit there for hours watching them go through demos that you could be spent doing other things with.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, one of the things that I've always done, both when I was back at Intel or heck, even at Cylance, there's, you know, my team, not everybody would go, but there would usually be more than one attendee. And also in your plan, if you're in an organization that hasn't a size to it and you're able to send a couple people, is do a little bit of divide and conquer, you know, because there are so many different facets and in essence functions that a chief security officer or chief information security officer needs to perform, and doing a divide and conquer and assigning team members to go evaluate particular areas, and then post the event have people write up trip reports. You know, what did they learn? What did they see? Again, that reflection, like we're doing, is useful once you get out of the noise and the chaos of the conference, to step back and really, look through those notes and come to some potential conclusions on new insights that you learned and or new things that you should evaluate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. I mean, a lot of people don't even go in there with a plan. Most people show up and they're more planning what parties they're going to go to as opposed to, what strategy, what do they want to get out of the conference? Because one of the biggest aspects of RSA is you get out of it whatever you intend to get out of it and look for. If you look, for example, you go to sessions. It's like if you just say, okay, which sessions look like they're the most interesting, it's like, okay, fine. But if you don't say, what are my job functions, even just going to say, what do I want to learn about in advance? And you're just looking around to see which sessions you could get in randomly without standing in line too long, you're going to have a pretty bad experience. And
yeah, or for some of the parties and stuff, it's a networking event, catching up with peers that otherwise you might not see face to face, other than once a year at a RSA conference or another conference. But I think you're right. Well, it really just becomes that strategy and the plan that you've created ahead of time, and then how do you reflect back on it afterwards?
Well, I think that's, Frank, I'm not trying to say you and I are, say exceptional in something or other, but when we go to different events, we go in there with the intent that networking is part of it. It's intentional networking. When I determine which parties of the dozens of parties a day I go to, I'm like, okay, where are the people I want to connect with going to be? And so for the networking part, it's like clearly there are some people you sit down and say, I want to make sure I have lunch with these people. There's some people it's like, okay, let's try to sync up at different parties, or I know my friends work at different vendors. I'll go to their parties and so on. But the reality is that's a strategic decision that you walk in with, that are you walking in there for a strategic decision on which party to go to, or are you going there to see which party is going to have the best alcohol? There's a significant difference in party planning that way.
Well, and this brings me to a change of subject, but perhaps related, in terms of, again, the purpose, the intent, the focus that you bring to things. Artificial intelligence certainly is the core capability and focus of Cylance and the company and our products. But the use of the term artificial intelligence or AI has certainly a little bit last year, but certainly this year, been all over the RSA conference floor. And there's some that have honestly just added it as a marketing message and not really doing much about it. But what's your view? Or is the term AI everything is the same? When somebody labels it AI, is there some misnomers being used, and or some really just adding a minor feature and really don't have any competencies in it, and trying to portray it as something more?
Yeah, well, I should say, for people interested specifically in that question, I chaired a panel at RSA that people can go back and listen to, where I had some really smart people in the AI world, Oliver Friedrich, Dustin Hillard, and Ramesh. I can't pronounce her last name no matter how well I know it. But you go back and listen to that, because that was one of the topics we discussed. Specifically, people are using AI as a buzzword. They're like most companies, not like Cylance has AI as a core feature of what they're doing. That's how the product was intended to be designed, to account for future threats and so on. Other people are adding AI as kind of like, well, we had this tool, how can we make our tool a little bit more advanced, and let's come up with something there. Because AI has machine learning, AI has natural language processing, there are different functions of AI, but the question is, how is it being applied to the issue at hand? Too many people are out there just adding AI because it's cool to add AI, and frankly, it's not that hard to just slap a little bit of AI on top of a product that's already there to make it sound more intelligent. You have to look
and
at how it was embedded.
Yeah, and the business outcomes that are achieved out of it. There was a paper that Cylance had published last year on, in essence, the generations of AI. And again, if somebody's just starting it, they're generationally behind. There's a maturation that occurs when you're focusing on this stuff. Much like when I was at Intel, Intel had process technology for silicon manufacturing, and there's a generational aspect to these things in terms of the features that you're extracting, the efficacy you're getting out of it, the business outcome that's achieved. And again, recognizing for everybody, whether it's the term AI or other terms that get thrown around, really dig in and understand what somebody's really doing and what they're achieving out of the labels they might be putting on their products.
Well,
one of the other things that, go ahead.
I was going to say that there's a saying that I always have, I learned once in ironically a Tony Robbins seminar: features tell and benefits sell. When you start looking at a product, it still comes back to that. The fact AI is there, okay, that could indicate something, but you don't look at what AI, saying, oh, I have AI does. You look at what are the benefits the implementation of AI provides. And that's really how you should be looking at it. Say, AI aside, what does this product do for me? Again, like Cylance does some really great things because it's the core functionality of it. But you got to look at, okay, that's AI. Okay, fine. What's the benefit being brought to me because you say you're using AI? That's the bigger issue people need to think about.
Yeah, totally agree. What's the business outcome? How did it affect the risk curve? How does it affect your total cost of controls? And does the capability or the product or the solution disrupt the user experience, or does it improve the user experience? There's those three things have always been, the core business outcomes I've been looking for when I evaluate security solutions. Now, one of the other things that's, certainly a hot topic, it was all over RSA as well, and it's coming up here to go live, on the 25th, GDPR. And, it seemed like everybody was saying they had a GDPR capability. Did you see this a lot, across the RSA conference, and how much of it do you think is real capability versus, again, FUD being thrown around to hopefully drive people to buy something that in some cases they may not need?
I frankly think 99% of it is FUD. Because I should say 99, maybe 95% of it is FUD. The reality is, to implement GDPR, that is a whole business process. It's not a technology. When you look at GDPR, there's ways of how are you handling information? How are you taking information in? How are you storing the information, and so on? That is not a technology at a high level. You need technologies to implement the business process. That's a given. But too many companies were out there saying, well, we handle GDPR because we do this. And, I'm involved with this other company that does good data indexing and everything like that. And that helps with GDPR. So the product can help with it, but the product does not provide you GDPR compliance. And too many people are losing sight of that. And again, much like we said, you have to go in with a strategy to RSA. If you don't have a GDPR complete business strategy and evaluation, you're not, no technology is going to make you compliant with that. And I think that a lot of people looking there, if they weren't very familiar with it, but they have a concern and haven't been dealing with this for a long period of time, probably are going to buy a lot of tools and then be hit by the fact their tools, much like the old days, but just because you have a firewall, that never meant you had a security program. Just because you buy a tool that might help with GDPR, it doesn't provide you GDPR compliance if you're not doing things fundamentally right.
Yeah, no, and that brings up a good point, and something that I'll just mention for everybody to think about when it comes to security tools and security capabilities. You know, security does not equal privacy, and I think a lot of the security industry confuses that, because you need good security to have privacy, but privacy has different nuances, different risk dynamics, different things to think about. And you know, for those that are listening, you should be evaluating your security tools and your security capabilities for the impact they have on privacy to your users, whether they be in the US, Europe, or some other nation state, because a lot of security tools can inherently increase your privacy risk because they're bulk collecting machine data and transiting it to a cloud and sharing it with others. There's a bunch of potential privacy concerns when you get into security capabilities, and just want to make sure that people, when they're thinking about that, if they don't own privacy in the security office, they need to be heavily partnered with the privacy team, and they should be also evaluating their security processes and security tools and capabilities for the potential privacy risk that they might be generating, and make sure they're also controlling for that.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because a lot of people don't realize that, you know, security logging capabilities, which are frankly awesome for us from a security perspective, so we could go back over time and, you know, analyze incidents, find incidents, you know, or even just make things much more, you know, optimized. You know, that's, you're collecting data that might impact user privacy and privacy in general. So that's a really good point that most people don't pick up.
Yeah. You know, one of the other things that we've talked about before, and it's good to reflect back on, is the fundamentals on how systems are hacked. Yeah, can you share your thoughts on this, Ira? Because again, it will hopefully allow people to then reflect back on what they saw, what they heard, what they walked away from RSA, and use that kind of almost getting back to basics to help them evaluate what they should be doing going forward.
Yeah, I've always said that there's only, no matter what happens, no matter what the technologies are, there's really only two fundamental ways to hack a computer. And yes, this includes networks, whatever. But the two fundamental ways to hack a computer are to take advantage of vulnerabilities built into the software. In other words, you know, all software has bugs. Some bugs create elevated privileges, information leakage, or whatever the case may be. And those are what we know as security vulnerabilities. And now the software is written into hardware, you know, it's firmware, it's whatever you call it. But all of this contains potential vulnerabilities. Now, in the ideal world, vendors find out about the vulnerabilities. I mean, hopefully they don't issue the software with vulnerabilities embedded in it. Or if they do, they tell you about it and you can plan to mitigate it. But, you know, eventually somebody finds the vulnerability, hopefully reports it responsibly, so the vendor has a chance to fix it and then push out the updates. Most of the time, the biggest problems occur because users don't fix the known vulnerabilities. They don't patch the systems for it. So that's where things, for example, this is dating, but things like Code Red, NIMDA, Slammer, and a whole bunch of other things all occurred because people didn't patch for widely known vulnerabilities. But that's
at the same time, though, patching also introduces a risk, because when you're patching, you're either taking away code or you're adding code. But anytime you make a change to a system, you're introducing an operational risk. And so some cases, patching, though it's a necessary hygiene, could also impact the business, impact your users, impact your shareholders, because of the disruption that it could create.
Well, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that this is a fundamental way. And yes, patching has to be applied appropriately. So that's a given, and patching should be tested and so on. But I'm just saying that generally, the first way to hack a computer is because of this. And if it provides new vulnerabilities, to be generally, does implementing a patch, can it break something? Yes. However, at the same time, not implementing the patch, and if it's a known vulnerability, leaves you very wide open to attacks. And that has to be accounted for. It's basically a risk-reward issue when you start implementing patching. And
exactly, as well as additional compensating controls that you might have in your environment, should you not be able to patch.
Right. So, for example, people were complaining like, the WannaCry or not patch, I lose track of which one was which, honestly. But when systems were hit, people were saying, oh, I can't update my system because I'm using an MRI system that's based on Windows 95 or some outrageous thing. I'm like, okay, you can fix it for that, but did you go ahead and isolate the system? You know, did you go ahead and take other mitigating controls? And a lot of people, you know, you can patch or you can implement mitigating controls. And in a lot of cases, people did not properly segment their networks if they said they couldn't patch. And that's where a lot of people who were hit, like hospitals, you know, critical systems on hospitals, you know, I'm not personally qualified to say whether or not you should patch a medical device based upon an outdated operating system. But I do know if you didn't patch that operating system, you really need to go ahead and take the mitigating controls.
Yeah,
but anyway,
totally agree.
But that's kind of the first way, which actually ties into the second way. So the first way is, you know, somebody to hack a computer, you take advantage of vulnerabilities built into the software, firmware, you know, whatever. The next way to hack a computer is by taking advantage in the way a user, administrator, or anybody else who is responsible for the system configures or maintains the system. So for example, in the case of, like we just mentioned, if you're not taking mitigating controls are a way of configuring the system. Bad passwords, somebody choosing to have a bad password is somebody going ahead and implementing the system poorly.
Or somebody someone choosing to give up their password because somebody calls them and tells them they're the IT help desk specialist, and they give up their password because they didn't think about the fact that the help desk wouldn't call and ask that. But you're right, users can be exploited based upon their weaknesses and their behaviors.
Yeah, and when so in the early days, like the early 2000s, I was talking to people from the CERT, and they were saying that generally 97% of all attacks were 97% of all attacks against DoD were preventable. 99% of all attacks against the commercial world were preventable. And then when they look at that, you know, of those 97% that were compromised, they determined that 70% of the compromises resulted in the way a user or admin configured or maintained the system, while only 30% resulted from the vulnerabilities built into the software. So and to that point,
again, configuration is everything from did I patch, did I not patch, how did I set the administrative privileges, or did I leave an outdated control in place like traditional AV that's dependent upon victims and response and reaction controls? Because again, as a systems administrator, as a decision maker around the controls in the environment, if I've decided to leave an outdated technology in place as my control, that will be exploited. And we've continued to see that time in again, over and over. Now, this brings me to this next set of items, and I think we were talking about the fundamentals, and you know, I was just getting to the Band-Aid remedies that never last, that we have prolific deployments of in the industry. But you know, when I went back and re-looked at some of the keynote perspectives, you know, there was a lot of good perspectives in the keynotes, but there was also a few areas that I'll just say I was left unsettled with. And one of them was the opening keynote here. And it was interesting to talk about and think about the dialogue here, where there was a focus on let's just keep things as they are and do incremental change. Let's strive for 1% improvement in all of our existing controls. And though that notion is interesting, you know, Ira, it'd be interesting in your view as to whether or not that's good enough, whether or not a 1% change in existing controls and an incremental approach to the path that we've been on now for decades is good enough. Or I tend to certainly have a view that you need transformational change, and there's certainly areas that we need to do better on, but we need transformational change, in my view. I'd be interested in your perspective.
This is exactly a case of where something old is new again. There's the whole concept of, God, now I'm dating myself, but Deming and total quality management, and the whole principle that if there are 10 steps in a process and every process only has a 1% error rate, or 1% defect rate, whatever it is, and that doesn't sound bad, 1% is okay, but when you add 1% to each of 10 different processes, that adds up to 10% defective. Now, that's significant. Now, a little bit to their credit, if everyone can go ahead and make every product incrementally better, which I would appreciate to a certain extent, that would potentially alleviate a lot, because security is a comprehensive set of processes, procedures, and everything else. Now, the reality, though, is we're in an industry where one small error can ruin everything when people don't look at their security program as a comprehensive program to constantly mitigate everything. So that's one aspect of it. At the same time, if every product could get 1% better, we have some improvement there, and it's not terrible, but the fact of the matter is we need to do better, because we're also in an industry where, sorry, I'm going on, but like there's a difference in defects in cars coming back and having to be recalled compared to a security vulnerability, which can basically ruin your whole network or go undetected. So that also has to be considered.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's why I wanted to reflect back on this and get people to really think about what is the difference between incremental change and transformational change. Can incremental change is, step-by-step variations in degree along an established path or system framework. It's based on precedent and intended to do more of the same, but better. I think we've been, as an industry, trying to do more of the same and a little bit better, and look at the risk curves we have. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, do a 1% change everywhere, but I don't think that that's good enough. And I think one of the reasons why Cylance was created, why I left my role at Intel to do a similar role at Cylance and run internal security, is I wanted to see transformational change. We can't continue the risk curves that we have today. And transformational change is a reconceptualization of what's possible. It's a discontinuity from the existing system, but it also evokes a level of resistance, fear of separation from the past and fear of failing in an attempt to have a creative leap. And I really hope that when people, again, reflect back on what they saw at RSA, they do look for where they can make incremental improvements. We all need to do that and have a continuous improvement cycle. But focus on where you can make some transformational change. That will make a tremendous difference in the risk curves that your organization sees.
Well, that also goes to how companies need to invest in security. So, for example, and I like analogies, but let's use the analogy of a car. When you know, when people were using horse-drawn carriages. I saw an old video of New York with horse-drawn carriages from the 1900s and one or two cars going by. And you know something? If we still rely, you know, people probably sat there and said, those cars, I don't find enough gas stations or something like that. You know, how am I going to fill this up? You know, I can get hay anywhere for my horse. That's kind of, in a little ways, what people are almost thinking here. The good part, though, is we are not changing an entire infrastructure to support converting from horses to cars, which really needed to be done. It revolutionized the way we live, commute, where we can work, and so on. But likewise, when you're looking at a product, for example, like Cylance, Cylance is revolutionizing the way you look at malware and protecting from malware. It's not an incremental improvement. It was designed fundamentally. And the good part is it's not requiring a completely different infrastructure. And so there's ways to take transformational change and build it into what's already being done incrementally. It's not like we have to take away an entire infrastructure. I mean, there are some technologies you maybe have to re-architect your entire network, but there are a lot of transformational technologies coming out where you can go ahead and start focusing, hey, you know what? I do need incremental change perhaps in my SIM at the moment, but I can start implementing basic, you know, I can start implementing transformational change in the way I deal with malware going forward. Because, you know, at this moment, I could swap out my software on my endpoints from one thing to another really easily these days.
Yeah, and you know, and that brings up another interesting point when you talked about the horse, you know, drawn carriage or buggy or just horseback to car transformation, and you know, and sometimes the things that we talked about earlier, the labeling of things, putting a tire on the side of a horse doesn't mean you've got a car, and it does at times feel like some in the industry are again slapping a label on something or adding something that may not actually be as transformative as it might pretend to be because of the way in which they're adding, quote unquote, a feature versus really re-architecting what's possible.
Yeah, I mean, we've got people have to look through the marketing. Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. We've just got, you know, another few minutes left, and you know, I read, you know, maybe some wrap up comments from you on just again your reflection on RSA, as well as, you know, going forward, what would you like to see in the industry? What would you like to see at perhaps the next RSA or the next security conference that could be more transformational for, you know, users or attendees to walk away with?
Okay, so just in summary, if you're going to go to RSA, if you're just there for the parties, great, look for the parties. If you're actually there to improve the security of your organization, you know, as we were discussing early on, you really do need to go to a plan. You go with a plan, and frankly, it might not. So, for example, you need to know what technologies you're looking for. What do you want to learn about specific buzzwords? What are your peers doing that you might want to look at, and so on. And frankly, you know, I make fun of parties sometimes, but that does include the networking. Networking is the most valuable aspect of that conference for me, and I'm sure for many people. However, if you're going to look around the vendor floor, you need to go with a plan. And simultaneously, I also want people to go with a plan for their career. You know, if you think you want to hear about a new technology or you want to sit in and learn new skills, figure out which presentations are going to be the most valuable for you in your current position as well as for future positions. So that's one thing. Now, regarding RSA as a whole, what do I really want to see? You know something? I have to admit, I like the fact RSA is at the point where it has become not a single track focus with, you know, very specific on cryptography and a few other sessions that might be useful, but it's kind of become the experience you want to make of it. There are some problems with it clearly, but, you know, if I was to sit here how to make something better, I don't think there'd be 50,000 people attending a year if there was an inherent value for 50,000, well, let's say at least for 20,000 of them, because the other 30,000, I don't know if they actually know what they're there for. But for the people who keep coming back, you know, obviously I would like to see a little bit of deep dives and everything, but otherwise, you know, it's become something where I can make of it what I want. And with that in mind, it's hard for me to say how I would improve it. It's kind of like going to a food court.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I've been going to the RSA conference now for, I think this was my 15th or 16th year. I've continued to see the evolution of it, the maturation of it, the growth. And like you, I like the fact that it's not one single track. I like that there's many voices and many visions from the different participants in the conference. And I'll continue to go back and extract value out of it and reflect back on it so that way I can see what I perhaps didn't see. And I love the fact that you can go back and watch the keynotes, go back and look at some of the press releases and the social media items that came out of it. And with that, again, Ira, thank you for participating. If folks have any questions, feel free to toss them in the chat window. And if not, we'll wrap up here shortly, and there'll be a survey here at the end. We'd love your feedback on not only this webinar, but other ones that we might do in the future and things that you would like to see from us. Again, thank you, Ira, for your time and for your valuable input.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.